Hello again, I'm Ryan Hill. And today we're going to talk about Jack Johnson. And many of us have heard of Jack Johnson, but you say, Jack Johnson, oh, the first black heavyweight champion of the world. Uh, but yes, he was. He was considered America's first great black sports superstar. Um, and we'll talk about him, but he tweaked the wrench, the common wrench, while he was in prison in 1921 in Fort Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He tweaked the common wrench, and he used that wrench, of course, to perform different household duties, chores, fixing things, but also to work on his sports cars. He was an avid lover of sports cars, and we'll talk about that passion that he shared too. But he was America's first black superstar, and one of my favorite. Ali even stated that he and Jack Johnson were the same. The difference was that Jack Johnson liked white women. And Jack later stated that it wasn't so much that he favored white women. He had been in several black or Negro relationships and had gotten hurt so badly. So he had just slanted that way towards white women. And we'll talk about his three white wives that he had at the time, too. But he was nicknamed the Galveston Giant, Jack Arthur Johnson. He was born in 1878 in Galveston, Texas. Again, his nickname was the Galveston Giant. He was considered America's first black sports superstar, like we stated. Jack Johnson became the first African American world heavyweight boxing champion in 1908. He held the title from 1908 to 1915. Jack Johnson made his debut as a professional boxer in 1898 in Galveston, Texas. Jack knocked out Charlie Brooks in the second round of a 15-round fight. In 1901, Johnson fought Joe Chonsky in Galveston. Chonsky was a popular and experienced heavyweight, and he knocked Johnson out in the third round. Now, back then, fighting was illegal. So Jack Johnson and Chonsky were jailed for fighting, and it was $5,000 bail. So they spent time in jail for 23 days fighting to lower the bail to get out. And they became good friends. And Jack credited Chonsky for his boxing prowess. He said, he made me a good fighter. He taught me the basics of fighting, made me a better fighter. And Chonsky told Jack, he said, hey, a man that can move like you in the ring should never get hit. So it said, like I said, prize fighting was illegal in Texas at that time. Both were arrested. Johnson and Chonsky spent 23 days in jail sparring to reduce the bail to an affordable level, which was initially the bail was $5,000. Johnson credited his boxing success to his sparring sessions in jail with Chonsky. And again, like he said, Chonsky said, a man that can move like you should never get hit. And they remained friends to the end, till they both passed. Colored fighters. Of course, Jack, he was the colored champion initially. Johnson defended the colored heavyweight title 17 times. He defeated colored ex-champs such as Denver Martin, Frank Childs, Sam McVee, and Sam Langford. Johnson fought Joe Jeanette 7 times. Now, he fought Joe Jeanette 7 times with 4 wins, 2 draws, and 1 loss on disqualification. Jack was disqualified and won, I don't know, for low blows or something. But he fought Langford. He beat Langford once. A lot of people accused Jack Johnson of ducking or avoiding Langford. Langford was like that Tyson of the time, you know, that George Foreman of that time, you know, the guy that you didn't want to see. So a lot of them accused Jack of ducking Langford, but he did beat Langford once, and he fought Langford one time back then. He was accused by other colored fighters as well for evading them or thinking that he forgot where he came from. He said, "Hey, Jack, you forgotten about us." Some of the fighters would say, colored fighters. And Jack later stated that, "I'm not forgetting about any of us. It's just that I can get more money fighting white fighters than I can fighting colored fighters." So he knew that. And Jack knew the racism of the time was venomous. You know, he knew that people would gladly pay and watered at the mouth to see him lose, you know, to a white champion. And we'll get into some of those fights too, but, you know, it's like the Jim Jeffries fight we'll talk about in 1910. So Johnson won the World Colored Heavyweight Championship on February 3rd, 1903, beating Denver Ed Martin on points in a 20-round match. Johnson held the title, color title, for 5 years until 1908. And that's when we talked about, of course, when he won the heavyweight title in 1908 after he moved on from the colored heavyweight title. So in 1908, he beat Tommy Burns in Sydney, Australia, for the heavyweight title. And Jack, he taunted and chased Tommy Burns around for several years, trying to get him to fight him. Burns kept refusing. I mean, if Burns was in London, Jack would show up there. If Burns was in Stockholm, Jack would show up there. Jack, an immaculate dresser, a guy who's unabashedly unashamed, very proud. He wore the championship status, the black superstar status, well, even before he was champion. He was a guy who exuded confidence, but a likable guy as well. And to be big in stature, an immaculate dresser, loved sports cars, and parading white women in public in 1908, man, you can imagine. You can imagine some people wanted his head. And reading his story and looking back on it, you wondered why he wasn't shot in broad daylight. I mean, my goodness, you know, some men just wanted his head from day one. But Jack would later say when he won the championship, he said, "I'm Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world. I'm black. They never let me forget it." And then Jack would reply, he would say, "I'm black, all right. I'll never let them forget it. He said, "So I'm black. I'll never let them forget that I'm black and proud, that I'm black and standing strong and tall." Like I said, he won the championship in 1908 over Tommy Burns in Sydney, Australia. Burns got $30,000 for the fight, so they kept offering more money to Burns, and eventually he accepted, and Jack defeated him in 1908 in Sydney, Australia. And like I said, he followed Burns around the world for 2 years, taunting him in the press until Burns finally gave in and Jack defeated him in 1908. Jack would hold the title until 1915. But in 1910, July 4th, 1910, this was billed as the fight of the century with Jim Jeffries. Gentleman Jim Jeffries. Jack defeated Gentleman Jim Jeffries in Reno, Nevada. The fight was initially going to be in San Francisco, but politics and different things moved it out of California, and they had it in Reno. Jim Jeffries was a retired fighter, you know, great fighter, and then had become a farmer who had gained a lot of weight, was out of shape. He was considered the great white hope at the time. You know, who was going to shut up this proud, black, tall champion, Jack Johnson? Who was going to knock down the Galveston Giant? And we know the movie. For those of you that have seen it, the 1970 movie, The Great White Hope with James Earl Jones, he played Jack Johnson in that movie, The Great White Hope. And the woman that was in that movie that you mostly saw where Jack was on the run, where he went overseas and all of that, we'll talk about that, where he went on the run for 7 years instead of serving a jail sentence initially. That was Lucille Cameron. She was his second wife. White wife at the time, and she was with him while he was on the run and overseas. and we'll get into that. But this fight with Jim Jeffries, it was considered the fight of the century. You had other white fighters that went and sparred with Jim Jeffries that tried to help him get in shape, rallied around him, everything. And Jeffries lost considerable weight, got in good shape for this fight. And everybody was going to be the hope of the race, who's going to knock this black champion down and shut him up and silence this big Galveston giant, Jack Johnson. Jack embarrassed Jim Jeffries, needless to say. It wasn't even close. And the thing about Jack, I looked at some of the clips on him. He was ahead of his time as far as footwork and far as tactical work. He even played with some of his opponents. He would hold them, talk to them, just go on his bicycle for a little while. Then he would turn up the speed or turn it up a notch and then hit them, score on points, and then grab them again and talk to him. I mean, he was something they weren't ready for, a big man that could move like that and hit like that, like Chomsky said. Johnson lost his title in 1915 to Jess Willard in Havana, Cuba, before a crowd of 25,000. Johnson was knocked out in the 26th round of a 45-round fight. Now imagine this now, 26 rounds. We know today and what I grew up watching Ali and different things, there were only 15 rounds. A lot of them were 12 rounds. Can you imagine fighting 26 rounds outside in the heat in Havana, Cuba? My goodness. And this was scheduled to be a 45-round fight. Jack fought several fights like this where you had 20-plus rounds, 30 rounds. 45-round fight. A lot of them wouldn't make it to 45 rounds, but it was scheduled for 45 rounds. Oh, my goodness. Johnson fought professionally until age 60. He lost 7 of his last 9 fights. He fought so late in life because he needed the money. Johnson opened a successful and luxurious black and tax desegregated restaurant and nightclub. So his nightclub was desegregated. Now it was run by his white wife at the time, Lucille Cameron. Johnson was arrested on charges violating the Mann Act with Lucille Cameron. And the Mann Act, this was stating forbidding him to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. We know that's a trumped up charge, of course, but and this was a racially motivated charge that embroiled Johnson in controversy for years for his relationships, including marriages with 3 white women. Johnson was sentenced to a year in prison, and that's when he fled the country for 7 years, from 1913 to 1920. Johnson fought abroad and returned to the U.S. in 1920. He served his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Johnson tweaked and improved Fort Leavenworth. Johnson tweaked and improved the common wrench while in prison. Johnson used the wrench to work on household activities and his sports cars. Johnson also, after he beat Jim Jeffries in 1910, I guess a couple of months later, I think he raced Barney Oldfield. Barney Oldfield was the top guy in racing at the time. I guess he would have been the Richard Petty of that time, or Dale Earnhardt of that time. He was the top racer of that time, and Jack loved sports cars so much. He raced Barney Oldfield. It had a hard time getting that fight. I keep saying fight. Had a hard time getting that race off or accomplished because they had threatened to take Barney Oldfield's license, driver's license, his racing credentials from him if he raced Johnson. But the two of them managed to pull it off. They bet $5,000 on the race. Oldfield beat him, but Oldfield lost his license for 2 years. And Johnson later stated that he was through with the race car business. And a lot of whites were even happy with him losing. Said, well, if Jack can't be beaten in the ring, at least somebody white beat him in something, which was race car driving. and that was the sentiment at the time. But Jack stated that he was done with the racing business after losing in 3 heats to Oldfield. He said, "I can drive a car fast on a straightaway, but I'm not willing to take the chances that old Barney does." And that's what made Barney, and he said that's what made Barney the top man and top champion. You know, Barney would drive darn near as fast on a curve as he would on a straightaway. You know, he was fearless. You know, Barney Oldham. But I want to talk about the 3 wives real quick too. We talked about Jack winning that heavyweight championship in 1908. First wife was Etta Duryea. Married to her from 1911 to 1912. She was a socialite from New York, Long Island, I believe. She was married to Clarence Duryea, businessman, mogul, and she had bouts of depression. Johnson met her at a racing exhibition. Like I told you, he loved to attend race car track races, and he met her there. And later, she divorced, or her husband Clarence Duryea divorced her. But she had bouts of depression. You know, from Johnson's infidelity to sometimes Johnson beating her for thinking, because one time Johnson suspected her of sleeping with his chauffeur. So he beat her darn near to death. They reconciled and got married. But within a year, they were only married, I think, 1911 to 1912, and she shot herself, self-inflicted gun wound, and shot herself in 1912. So with the infidelity, the infighting with Jack, and then, of course, her socialite world ostracizing her, no longer allowing her in the clubs and to the luncheons and everything else, you know, they say, "Hey, you've disgraced us. You're running around with that big black heavyweight brute, and it's nowhere in the world that we're going to be seen in the country club with you again." So that depression, too, that topped it off, and she killed herself in 1912. Jack's second wife was Lucille Cameron. And Lucille Cameron, I think he was married to her. I was looking for those exact dates. But Lucille Cameron, 1912 to 1924. And he was with Lucille Cameron when he fled. So instead of Jack serving that initial sentence and going to Leavenworth, he fled from in 1913 because he was charged on the Mann Act, you know, transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. She was his girlfriend at the time. She might have even been his wife at the time because she was his second wife. But so Jack got on a steamer. They got on a steamer and went abroad. He continued to fight abroad, and he lost the championship in 1915 to Jess Willard. To Jess Willard in 1915, and that was in Havana, Cuba. Like you heard me mention earlier, a 45-round fight that ended in 26 rounds. And some people thought Jack threw the fight so he could beat the jail charge and come back to America. But Jess said, well, if he was going to throw the fight, I wish he had done it a lot sooner. It was hard as bejesus out there because, you know, Havana, Cuba, like I said now, 26 rounds. Jess said if Jack Johnson threw the fight, I wish he would have thrown it a lot earlier, maybe in the 3rd or 4th round or something, because they fought 26 rounds in the sweltering heat of Havana, Cuba, in a scheduled 45-round fight. So like I said, from 1913 to 1921, he was on the run. He came back to America and served that sentence at Leavenworth, and that's where he tweaked the wrench while he was in prison. He worked on the wrench. He worked on improved methods of using the common wrench. Some people thought it was a monkey wrench or whatever, but 100 years ago, another gentleman had actually coined that term and had worked on the initial monkey wrench. So that had nothing to do with Jack Johnson. Some people thought They called it the monkey wrench because he, a black man, big brute, had invented had invented the wrench or tweaked the wrench. But what he did is refine the wrench at the time and tweaked it. It was something. It was a couple other points. So his third wife, Irene Pinot. His third wife, Irene Pinot. He met her in Illinois, and he spent his last years with her from 1925 to 1946. They traveled abroad, France, Europe. Some great looking pictures of them. But Irene Pinot was his last wife, and who he spent his waning years with. Like I say, Jack fought late in life too until he was 60 because he needed the money. Jack's death. Jack, 1946. He was born in 1878, died in 1946. He was driving in North Carolina. I think it was Franklinton, North Carolina. And he and a friend were refused service at a diner. They were hungry. Of course, segregation, Jim Crow in full effect. They wouldn't serve him, so Jack sped off angrily from the diner with his friend, another buddy of his, and he hit a tree. Jack didn't survive. They tried to get him to the Negro or colored hospital at the time. I think that was St. Agnes Hospital, Black Hospital, which was 25 miles away. You know, by the time they got to a black hospital, something very similar to Charles Drew, where the black hospital was so far away. So Jack had bled to death and died by the time they got him in St. Agnes. He was 68 years old. His friend did survive the car crash. But again, his legacy, even speeding away from there, a very proud man. You know, he got a ticket one time, and I think my dad told me this initially, and then we went over it the other day. He got a ticket one time for speeding. I forget what state it was in, but he was going down south, and might have been North Carolina, South Carolina, or something, but it was a $50 ticket. And a $50 ticket in the 1900s, figuring what, 1908, 1909, forget what year. But at that time, $50 was probably like $2,000. And Jack gave the officer a $100 bill. And the officer said, "I don't have any change." And Jack said, "Don't worry about it. Keep it. Because I'm going to be speeding on the way back. So keep the $100 bill because you're going to give me another $50 ticket on the way back because I'm going to be doing the very same thing on the way back." And that was Jack Johnson. Legacy. He was an inaugural 1954 inductee to the Ring Magazine's Boxing Hall of Fame, which disbanded in 1987, and was inducted to the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1933. In 2005, the United States National Film Preservation Board deemed the film of the 1910 Johnson-Jeffries fight historically significant and put it in the National Film Registry. During his career, Jack Johnson fought 114 fights, winning 80 matches, 40 by knockouts. In the short term, the boxing world reacted against Johnson's legacy. But Johnson foreshadowed one of the most famous boxers of all time, and I spoke about Ali earlier. In fact, Ali often spoke of how he was influenced by Jack Johnson. Ali identified with Johnson because he felt America ostracized him in the same manner because of his opposition to the Vietnam War and affiliation with the Nation of Islam. In 2002, scholar Molefi Keti Asante listed Jack Johnson on his list of 100 greatest African Americans. And in 2012, the city of Galveston, where Jack was born, his beloved Galveston, dedicated a park in Johnson's memory as Galveston Island's most famous native son. The park, called Jack Johnson Park, includes a life-size bronze statue of Jack Johnson. And then the actor Dwayne Johnson, we know as The Rock. His last name is in homage to Jack Johnson. His father, Rocky Johnson, and I remember his father, Rocky Johnson. He was Intercontinental Champion with Tony Atlas in the 80s. We used to go to the Cap Center and see wrestling on Saturdays, Cap Center in Landover, Maryland. But his father, Rocky Johnson, chose his professional wrestling moniker to honor the boxer and later made Johnson his legal name. So his father, Rocky Johnson, named his name Johnson, made his last name Johnson in honor of Jack Johnson. And I didn't know that. I just thought his name was Rocky Johnson and The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. But in homage in honor of Jack Johnson. And a fine choice to even recognize Jack. But like I said, he was America's first black superstar, sports superstar, Jack Johnson. A man who did it his way, like Frankie would say, and did it a great way. And tweaked the wrench too. A lot of people didn't know about his passions, and race car driving was one of them. Again, glad to talk with you all again about another inventor. We know how common the wrench is today and how we use the wrench for everything else. So don't just remember Jack for the boxing, for his boxing acumen. Remember Jack too for the wrench and the ways that he improved the common wrench. I'll see you next time. Thank you.